Lorenzo Moretti possessed enough wealth to buy entire hospitals, but he felt completely helpless watching his 19-year-old daughter scream in agony. Sofia sat in the center of the most expensive restaurant in the city, clutching her legs as mysterious nerve spasms tore through her body. Every specialist in the world had failed them. Just as Lorenzo prepared to storm out in a rage, a young waitress named Elena knelt on the floor. She did not bring water or a menu. She reached for Sofia's trembling legs, and what happened next shocked everyone. Let's dive into today's story. Lorenzo Moretti stared out the tinted window of his armored limousine as the city of Chicago blurred into streaks of gold and steel, a kingdom he had conquered yet felt entirely estranged from in this suffocating moment of silence. He was a man who moved mountains with a single signature, a tycoon whose name was etched onto the skyline in bold letters. Yet, as he sat beside his 19-year-old daughter, Sofia, he felt smaller than a grain of dust. Sofia sat rigidly on the plush leather seat, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of an ebony cane that looked tragically out of place against the delicate silk of her designer evening gown. The air in the car was thick with the scent of expensive leather and the heavier, unspoken weight of their shared terror. For months, a mysterious neurological fire had ravaged her legs, a phantom agony that the most prestigious doctors in Switzerland and New York had failed to extinguish or even name. Lorenzo watched a bead of sweat trace the curve of her pale temple, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He cleared his throat, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet cabin. "Are you certain you are up for this, Tesoro? We can turn back," he asked, his voice cracking with a vulnerability he never showed in the boardroom. Sofia turned her gaze toward him, her eyes shadowed by exhaustion, but lit with a fierce, brittle determination. "I cannot hide in my room forever, Dad. It is just dinner. I want to feel normal," she whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the lie. They were heading to La Vita, the city's most exclusive sanctuary of gastronomy, hoping for a fleeting illusion of normalcy. But Lorenzo knew they were merely driving into another battlefield where her pain was the enemy. While the limousine glided effortlessly over the asphalt, worlds away in the humid, chaotic underbelly of La Vita, Elena De Luca sat on an overturned milk crate inside the cramped, dry storage room, frantically counting a crumpled stack of dollar bills. At 23, Elena carried the weight of the world on her slender shoulders, her nursing school tuition looming over her like a storm cloud. The fluorescent light hummed above her, casting a stark glow on her weary face as she smoothed out a $5 bill, her lips moving in a silent, desperate calculation. 72. 73, she murmured, the total woefully short of what the bursar demanded by Friday. The smell of oregano and stale dishwater hung in the air, a stark contrast to the perfume of the wealthy guests she served. The noise of the kitchen was a symphony of clattering pans and shouting chefs, a world of relentless pressure that Elena navigated with a quiet dignity. She tucked a frayed, black and white photograph of her Sicilian grandmother deep into her apron pocket, her fingers lingering on the familiar paper edge, as if drawing strength from the woman who had taught her that healing was a language spoken with the hands. Suddenly, a crash of breaking china echoed from the kitchen corridor, followed by a string of panicked curses. Elena did not hesitate. She shoved her meager earnings into her pocket and sprinted toward the sound, finding a terrified busboy staring at a shattered platter of antipasto. Instead of scolding him or worrying about the delay, she dropped to her knees amidst the shards, offering him a reassuring smile that transformed her tired features. "It is just a plate, Marco. Breathe. We fix it together?" she said softly, picking up the sharp pieces with a grace that suggested she was used to mending broken things. completely unaware that her path was about to collide with the man who owned the city, bridging the gap between the desperate back of house and the glittering VIP dining room. The heavy mahogany doors of La Vita swung open before Lorenzo Moretti could even reach for the handle, revealing the hushed, amber-lit sanctuary of Chicago's culinary elite. Mr. Rossi, the restaurant manager, stood at the entrance with his hands clasped tightly in front of his chest, a bead of perspiration already glistening on his receding hairline despite the aggressive air conditioning. He bowed low, a gesture that bordered on theatrical desperation, terrified that a single misplaced napkin or a lukewarm greeting might bring down the wrath of the man who owned the building and half the city block. "Mr. Moretti, it is an absolute honor to welcome you back. Your usual table is prepared and we have cleared the surrounding area for your privacy." Mr. Rossi stammered, his voice trembling slightly as he gestured toward the velvet-roped section in the center of the room. Lorenzo barely acknowledged the man, his focus entirely on Sophia as she navigated the entryway, the rubber tip of her cane squeaking faintly against the marble floor. Every step she took was a battle against gravity and hidden agony, her knuckles bleaching white as she leaned heavily on the support, yet she held her chin high, refusing to let the pitying glances of the other diners penetrate her armor. The restaurant fell into a respectful, terrified silence as they passed, the clinking of silverware ceasing as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. They reached the VIP table, an island of pristine white linen isolated from the common patrons by a heavy red velvet rope, symbolizing the invisible fortress Lorenzo built around his life. He pulled out Sophia's chair with infinite gentleness, settling her as if she were made of spun glass, his eyes scanning her face for the grimace he knew she was hiding. "Bring me the 1982, Petrus, and do not bother with the tasting, just pour it," Lorenzo commanded without opening the wine list, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Mr. Rossi nodded frantically and retreated, snapping his fingers at the shadows. In the service station, panic was erupting because the head waiter had suddenly fallen ill, leaving the most dangerous table in the city unattended. Mr. Rossi grabbed Elena by the shoulder, his grip tight with anxiety. "You take table 1, De Luca, and for the love of God, do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact. Just pour the water and disappear," he hissed, shoving a crystal pitcher into her hands. Elena took a steadying breath, smoothed the front of her uniform, and stepped past the velvet rope into the lion's den. As she approached the table, the scent of expensive cologne and fear hit her, but her eyes were drawn immediately to the girl. Elena moved with the silent grace of a ghost, tilting the pitcher to fill the crystal goblets, and in that brief moment of proximity, her medical instincts flared to life. She saw the way Sophia's left hand trembled against the tablecloth, a subtle, rhythmic shaking that rippled up her forearm, and she noticed how the girl shifted her weight entirely to the right hip, keeping her left leg hovering just millimeters off the floor to avoid contact. It was clearly not just an injury, it was a neurological misfire, a specific nerve entrapment that caused cascading spasms, a pattern Elena had seen in her textbooks but rarely in person. She set the water down and offered a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes, breaking the strict protocol of invisibility Mr. Rossi demanded. "Good evening, miss. Take your time settling in," Elena said softly, her voice a soothing balm in the tense atmosphere. Lorenzo did not even turn his head, treating her with the absolute indifference one might show a lampstand, his gaze fixed on his daughter's pale face, completely unaware that the invisible servant he ignored was the only person in the room who truly saw them and the only one holding the key to the miracle they desperately needed. The arrival of the appetizers marked a deceptive shift in the atmosphere, as the suffocating tension that had gripped the table began to dissipate like mist under the morning sun. The heavy silence was replaced by the soft clinking of silver against fine china and the gentle hum of a cello playing in the dim corners of the room. Lorenzo watched his daughter closely, his shoulders dropping an inch as he saw the faint pink color returning to her pale cheeks, a rare sight that he guarded jealously. Sophia reached for a piece of bruschetta, her movements fluid and devoid of the tremors that had plagued her in the car, and for the first time in months she looked like a vibrant teenager rather than a fragile patient. She took a tentative bite, savoring the flavor, before looking up at her father with a smile that reached her eyes, transforming her entire face. "You know, Dad, these are smaller than I remember, or maybe I am just actually hungry for the first time in forever," she teased lightly, her voice carrying a note of lightness that made Lorenzo's heart swell with a mixture of love and relief. He chuckled, a sound that felt foreign in his throat, and raised his wine glass in a silent toast to the moment. "Then we shall order 10 more, cara mia, until you are full," he replied warmly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The warm lighting of the restaurant wrapped around them like a protective blanket, creating a fragile bubble of peace where the nightmare of hospitals and diagnoses felt miles away. It was a cruel illusion of safety, a calm that made them believe that the storm had finally passed, leaving them unaware that the worst pain was gathering strength in the shadows. The fragile illusion of normalcy that had settled over the table shattered in the span of a single heartbeat, proving just how cruel hope could be when it was built on a foundation of shifting sand. One moment, Sophia was reaching for her water glass with a trembling smile, and the next, her fingers spasmodically uncurled, losing all motor control as the heavy silver fork slipped from her grasp and clattered violently against the fine china plate. The sharp, dissonant sound rang out like a gunshot in the hushed dining room, causing heads at nearby tables to turn in irritation, but Lorenzo did not care about their stares because his entire world had just frozen in terror. He watched, helpless, as the color drained from his daughter's face as if a plug had been pulled, leaving her skin a translucent, sickly gray that matched the linen tablecloth she was now gripping with a desperate, white-knuckled force. Her eyes, which had been bright with laughter only seconds ago, went wide and vacant, staring at something invisible and terrifying that only she could see, a silent predator that had returned to claim her. Lorenzo felt a cold pit open in his stomach, a sensation he knew too well from the countless nights spent in emergency waiting rooms, recognizing the undeniable signs of an oncoming episode before a single word was spoken. The air in the restaurant suddenly felt too thin, the elegant cello music twisting into a mocking soundtrack to their suffering, and the warmth of the room evaporated into a chilling dread. "Sophia, look at me, breathe," Lorenzo commanded, his voice low and urgent, trying to anchor her drifting consciousness, but she did not respond, her jaw locking tight as the first wave of rigid tension seized her lower body. He saw the muscles in her neck cord, straining against an invisible agony that was rapidly climbing up her spine, and he knew instantly that the dinner was over, the peace destroyed, and the nightmare back in full force. It was not just a twitch, it was the onset of the siege, the neurological storm that turned her own body into a torture chamber. Without hesitating, he raised his hand and snapped his fingers aggressively at the staff, his face twisting into a mask of panic and authority that brooked no delay. "Check! Get me the check right now," he barked, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade, not caring that he was disrupting the refined atmosphere or that the bottle of 1982 Petrus remained untouched. The waiters froze in their tracks, confused by the sudden, violent shift from laughter to emergency, but Lorenzo was already pushing back his chair. the legs scraping harshly against the floor as he prepared to shield his child from the world, the luxurious meal abandoned and forgotten as the invisible monster of her illness sank its claws in deep, turning the sanctuary of La Vita into a cold, terrifying cage. The suffocating bubble of silent panic that had enveloped the table for mere seconds suddenly exploded with a violence that shattered the restaurant's decorum permanently. Sophia, who had been biting her lip until it bled in a desperate attempt to contain the fire raging inside her nerves, finally lost her battle against the overwhelming biological torture. Her mouth opened in a rictus of pure anguish, and a sharp, guttural scream tore from her throat, a sound so raw and filled with visceral suffering that it silenced the string quartet instantly and caused a waiter 3 tables away to drop a tray of crystal glasses. The crash of breaking glass was lost under the echoing resonance of her cry, which sounded less like a human voice and more like an animal caught in a steel trap. "Make it stop! Oh God, please make it stop!" She shrieked, her voice cracking as her body contorted, her left leg stiffening into a rigid, trembling plank of bone and seized muscle that refused to bend. The entire dining room turned as one, eyes wide with a mixture of horror, curiosity, and indignation, transforming her private medical emergency into a public spectacle of humiliation. Lorenzo moved faster than he had in 20 years, shoving his heavy chair back with such force that it toppled over with a deafening clatter, hitting the marble floor like a gunshot. He did not care about the noise or the damage. He lunged forward, catching Sophia just as she began to slide from her seat, wrapping his arms around her trembling shoulders to anchor her against the convulsing tremors racking her small frame. The whispers began immediately, a buzzing hive of judgment from the surrounding tables where the city's elite muttered about scenes and decorum, their hushed tones acting as gasoline on Lorenzo's blazing fury. He felt the vibration of her screams against his own chest, a physical transfer of helplessness that made him want to burn the world down. Do not just stare at her. Someone call a doctor. "Call Dr. Aris right now," Lorenzo roared at the frozen staff, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson, the veins in his neck bulging against his silk collar. He knew deep down that Dr. Aris was in New York and could not help them, but shouting was the only action left to a man who had lost all control. He pulled Sophia tighter, shielding her face from the prying eyes of the strangers, wishing he could absorb the agony into his own body, but the spasm only tightened its grip, locking her leg in a grotesque angle that defied anatomy. "I have you, Tesoro, I have you." He chanted desperately into her hair, a futile mantra against a pain that listened to no one, while the panicked energy of the room closed in on them, suffocating and cruel. The chaos swirling around table, one summoned Mr. Rossi not as a savior, but as a nervous guardian of the establishment's reputation, his face slick with a sheen of panic that had absolutely nothing to do with empathy and everything to do with damage control. He weaved through the stunned waiters, his polished shoes skidding slightly on the marble as he approached the epicenter of the disturbance, his hands wringing together in a pathetic display of feigned concern that barely masked his true priority, the comfort of the other wealthy patrons. Instead of asking if they needed an ambulance or offering aid, he leaned in close to Lorenzo, lowering his voice to a frantic, hissing whisper intended to contain the situation rather than resolve it. "Mr. Moretti, please, I must ask you to lower your voices immediately, or perhaps we can move you to the private dining room in the back," he stammered, his eyes darting nervously toward the mayor who was dining 3 tables away, visibly annoyed by the commotion. "The other guests are becoming quite distressed by the noise, and we cannot have a scene." The suggestion that his daughter's agonizing screams were merely noise, to be hidden away like dirty laundry, snapped the final tether of Lorenzo's restraint, transforming his fear into a blinding, white-hot rage. The billionaire rose to his full height, his imposing silhouette looming over the trembling manager like a thunderhead, his eyes blazing with a ferocity that made Mr. Rossi recoil physically. "Distressed? You worry about their distress while my daughter is screaming in agony," Lorenzo roared, his voice shaking the crystal chandeliers above them and causing the entire room to flinch. "Get away from us. Do not touch her, do not speak to me, just back off before I destroy this entire building." He shoved the manager aside with a violent sweep of his arm, a physical rejection of the polite society that demanded silence over suffering. Sophia was now sobbing uncontrollably, her face buried in her hands, her body rocking back and forth in a rhythm of pure misery as the muscle in her left calf remained locked as hard as stone. Refusing to release its torturous grip, "Daddy, it feels like the bone is breaking. Please, do something. It hurts so much." She gasped between jagged sobs, the sound tearing through Lorenzo's heart with the force of a jagged blade. He fell back to his knees beside her, his expensive Italian suit dragging in the spilled water, clutching her hand with a desperation that terrified him to his core. For all his billions, for all the skyscrapers he owned and the politicians he controlled, he was utterly impotent in this moment, reduced to a trembling father watching his child suffer. The gilded walls of the restaurant seemed to close in on him, the golden light turning sickly and oppressive, mocking him with its luxury, while the one thing he needed relief for, Sophia, remained impossibly out of reach, leaving him drowning in a sea of helplessness that no blank check could ever bridge. From the shadowed vantage point of the service station, Elena De Luca stood frozen like a statue, her knuckles white as she gripped the cold marble counter, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she watched the catastrophe unfold at table 1. While the other servers whispered in terrified huddles or averted their eyes to avoid the billionaire's wrath, Elena's gaze was locked with laser-like intensity, not on the screaming girl's face, but on her foot. She saw the peculiar, unnatural angle at which the left ankle was twisted, the toes curled inward like a claw, and the tendon behind the heel pulled taut as a bowstring, a specific physiological distortion that bypassed her nursing school training and struck a chord deep in her childhood memory. Suddenly, the smell of expensive truffle oil and fear faded, replaced by the scent of sun-baked dust and wild oregano from a small village in Sicily 13 years ago. She was 10 years old again, standing in her grandmother's stone kitchen, watching a neighbor, Signor Bruno, writhe on the floor in similar agony, his leg locked in a rigid spasm that the village doctor had failed to release. She heard her grandmother's voice, raspy and calm, echoing across time with crystal clarity. "Listen to me, Elena. The body is like a tangled net, and sometimes you must press the knot to free the rope." Nonna had whispered, guiding Elena's small thumbs to a hidden hollow just beneath the ankle bone. "Do not pull. Press and wait for the surrender." The memory was so vivid that Elena could almost feel the phantom vibration of the muscle releasing under her fingertips, a snap of tension followed by instant peace. She blinked, the sterile luxury of La Vita rushing back into focus, bringing with it the harsh reality of her precarious existence. She looked at Mr. Rossi, who was cowering near the wine rack, useless and trembling, and then at Lorenzo Moretti, a man who had just threatened to destroy the building and everyone in it. The logical part of her brain screamed at her to stay put, to remember the tuition bills in her pocket, the rent due on Tuesday, and the absolute certainty that interfering with a man like Moretti could end her career before it even began. "Stay back, De Luca. Do not get involved in this mess," a terrified busboy whispered beside her, tugging on her apron string, but his voice sounded miles away. Elena looked at Sophia, whose screams had dissolved into ragged, breathless whimpers of exhaustion, and felt a physical ache in her own chest that outweighed her fear of poverty. She realized with a terrifying clarity that she held the key to unlocking this torture, and to stand by and do nothing simply to save her job would be a betrayal of everything her grandmother had taught her. The choice crystallized in her chest, heavy and dangerous: safety for herself or relief for the stranger. Elena turned her back on the whispering busboy and the safety of anonymity, her decision hardening into a resolve that felt heavier than the massive silver trays she usually carried for 12 hours a day. She moved with a sudden, sharp purpose toward the polished service station, her eyes scanning the marble countertop, not for silverware or expensive wine lists, but for the specific tools of a healer disguised as dinner service. She grabbed a small, pristine ceramic bowl intended for finger rinsing and filled it rapidly from the hot water tap, testing the temperature against the sensitive skin of her inner wrist until it was warm but not scalding, a precise heat she remembered vividly from her grandmother's kitchen in Sicily. Next, she snatched a clean, thick linen napkin, the starch stiff against her trembling fingers, folding it with the precision of a surgical instrument rather than a table setting. Mr. Rossi, who was hovering near the pass like a nervous vulture waiting for the disaster to end, saw her unauthorized movement, and his eyes bulged with a mixture of confusion and terrified panic. He stepped aggressively into her path, his hand reaching out to clamp onto her arm, his fingernails digging into the fabric of her cheap uniform to physically restrain her. "DeLuca, what do you think you are doing? Put that down and get back to the kitchen right now before I have security throw you out on the street," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper that sprayed spit onto her cheek. But Elena was no longer just a terrified employee worried about next month's rent or her nursing degree. She was a woman on a mission of mercy. She jerked her arm away from his grip with a physical force that surprised them both, her dark eyes blazing with a fire that made the manager stumble back a step in shock. "Get out of my way, Mr. Rossi," she said, her voice low and steady, lacking any trace of the subservience he demanded from his staff. She did not wait for his response or his permission. She turned and marched straight toward the thick velvet rope that separated the working staff from the VIPs, the crimson barrier that defined her entire existence in this building. As she stepped over the thick cord, she felt a physical shift in the air pressure, a crossing of the Rubicon that separated the invisible servers from the untouchable elite. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird, counting down the seconds until her life imploded, but her feet kept moving across the plush carpet. The distance to table 1 felt like miles, and the sounds of Sophia's ragged whimpering pulled her forward like a magnet, overriding the screaming instinct of self-preservation that told her to run back to safety. She was walking into the lion's den, armed only with warm water and a napkin, a minnow swimming directly into the mouth of a shark. But as she looked at the father holding his sobbing child, she knew that the risk of being fired was nothing compared to the sin of doing nothing. Lorenzo Moretti heard the soft, rapid thud of footsteps approaching across the plush carpet, a sound that pierced through the red haze of his panic, like an unwanted intrusion into a sacred moment of grief. He whipped his head around, his eyes wild and bloodshot, expecting to see a paramedic or perhaps a doctor who had miraculously materialized from the ether, but instead, his gaze landed on the black and white uniform of a server. To him, in this moment of absolute crisis, the sight was not just disappointing, it was offensive. He saw a young woman holding a meaningless bowl of water and a napkin, tools of the hospitality trade that felt insultingly trivial against the magnitude of his daughter's suffering. The rage that had been simmering beneath his skin boiled over instantly, transforming his fear into a weaponized aggression directed squarely at the only target within range. He raised a large, trembling hand in the air, palm out, a physical barrier intended to stop her momentum before she could encroach further on their pain. "Get away from us. Did you not hear me?" "I said back off," Lorenzo roared, his deep voice booming off the vaulted, hand-painted ceiling with a ferocity that made the crystal glasses on the nearby tables vibrate. The sheer volume of his shout caused Sophia to flinch in his arms, her whimpers hitching for a fraction of a second, but Lorenzo was too consumed by his protective instinct to notice. He glared at Elena with a look of pure, unadulterated venom, seeing her not as a human being trying to help, but as a spectator coming to gawk at the fallen titan and his broken child, or worse, a servant offering useless pity to a king who needed a miracle. He stood up halfway, shielding Sophia's contorted body with his own broad shoulders, positioning himself as a wall between his daughter and the world. "She is in agony. She needs a specialist, a neurologist, not a waitress with a wet rag," he shouted, the words tearing from his throat with a mixture of scorn and desperation. The insult hung heavy in the air, stripping Elena of her dignity and reducing her to her job title, intended to shame her into an immediate retreat. The other diners watched in horrified silence, holding their breath, fully expecting security to descend, or for the young woman to burst into tears and flee the room. The atmosphere was thick with the expectation of her failure, the crushing weight of the class divide slamming down like a guillotine. Lorenzo's chest heaved with exertion, his eyes locking onto hers with a challenge, daring her to take one more step, his entire posture screaming that she was unwanted, unqualified, and unwelcome in his circle of suffering. He waited for her to run, to bow her head, and disappear back into the shadows where the help belonged, leaving him alone in his gilded cage of helplessness. Elena De Luca did not flinch, nor did she retreat into the safety of the kitchen shadows, as every survival instinct in her body screamed for her to do. Instead, she planted her feet firmly on the plush, expensive carpet, stopping just inches beyond the reach of Lorenzo's frantic, waving arm, anchoring herself like a heavy stone in the middle of a violent hurricane. The verbal assault from the billionaire washed over her, but instead of diminishing her resolve or making her cower, it stripped away the last remnants of her hesitation, replacing her server's deference with the quiet, unshakable authority of a woman who knew exactly what she was looking at. She did not raise her voice to match his booming rage. Instead, she lowered it, pitching her tone to a frequency of calm, absolute certainty that cut through the hysteria like a surgical scalpel. She looked directly into Lorenzo's bloodshot, terrified eyes, ignoring the immense power dynamic that said she was nothing, and spoke to him not as a frightened employee speaking to a master, but as one human being offering a desperate lifeline to another. "I can stop the pain, Mr. Moretti," she stated clearly, her voice steady and completely devoid of doubt, the words hanging in the air between them like a solemn promise. Lorenzo froze mid-motion, his mouth half open to shout another insult, stunned into absolute silence by the sheer audacity of her claim. He blinked rapidly, confusion warring with his anger, unable to comprehend how this young woman in a stained uniform could stand so tall against his wrath. Elena took a small, careful step forward, holding his gaze to show she was not afraid of him, only afraid for his daughter. "Please, sir, just give me 10 seconds. That is all I need. If it does not work, you can fire me, you can sue me, you can destroy my life. But give me 10 seconds to help her." The specific, concrete nature of the time limit pierced through Lorenzo's panic, offering a manageable boundary to the endless nightmare that was swallowing them whole. He looked down at Sophia, whose sobbing had quieted to breathless gasps, her tear-filled eyes locked on Elena with a mixture of confusion and desperate, pleading hope. The girl saw something in the waitress's face that her father missed: a deep recognition of her suffering and a confidence that it could be ended. Sophia reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against her father's sleeve, and gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a silent plea that roared louder than any scream. "Dad, let her," she whispered, the sound barely audible. That tiny surrender broke Lorenzo's defense completely. He looked back at Elena, his chest heaving, and for the first time he lowered his hand, stepping back just enough to create a space, a silent, terrified, and reluctant invitation for her to prove the impossible. With the reluctant permission hanging in the heavy air, Elena wasted not a single millisecond, dropping to her knees on the plush, wine-stained carpet with a thud that signaled her total disregard for her own comfort or the pristine state of her uniform. The damp cold of the spilled water immediately soaked through the fabric of her trousers, staining her knees with the grime of the restaurant floor, but she did not flinch or look down, her entire universe narrowing to the trembling limb of the girl before her. She placed the ceramic bowl of steaming water on the floor and dipped the folded linen napkin into it, wringing it out with practiced, steady hands until it was damp and radiating a gentle, moist heat. Lorenzo hovered over her like a thundercloud, his breathing ragged and loud in the silence, his eyes tracking her every movement with a terrifying intensity, ready to pull her away at the slightest sign of incompetence or harm. Elena ignored the looming threat of the billionaire and focused her dark, compassionate eyes on Sophia, whose face was still contorted in a mask of tear-streaked agony. "I am not going to hurt you, Sophia, I promise, but I need you to trust me for just a moment," Elena whispered softly, her voice a low hum of reassurance that cut through the panic. She gently lifted Sophia's left foot, feeling the unnatural rigidity of the muscle, the way the tendons were pulled tight as steel cables beneath the skin, vibrating with the chaotic electrical signals of the spasm. Sophia gasped sharply at the touch, her body tensing in anticipation of more pain, but Elena moved with the fluid confidence of a master craftsman. She wrapped the warm, steaming cloth around the ankle, letting the heat seep into the seized tissue to shock the sensory nerves, before sliding her thumbs deep into the soft, hollow space behind the ankle bone. This was the technique her grandmother had taught her, the search for the hidden trigger point that acted as the master switch for the leg's nerve cluster. Her thumbs probed the flesh, hunting for the knot, and she found it a hard, pulsing lump of trapped energy that felt completely alien to the soft tissue around it. The entire restaurant held its collective breath, the silence so profound that the hum of the refrigerator motors in the kitchen seemed deafening. Elena looked up, locking eyes with Sophia, and applied steady, increasing pressure to the spot while simultaneously rotating the foot inward. "Breathe with me now, in through your nose, out through your mouth. 1, Elena counted calmly, her thumbs digging deeper, searching for the release point that biology demanded but medicine had missed. Lorenzo took a step forward, his hands twitching, terrified by the sight of a mere stranger pressing so hard on his fragile child, but he forced himself to freeze, paralyzed by the desperate, insane hope that this waitress knew secrets his doctors did not. Elena kept her thumbs buried deep in the flesh of the girl's ankle, feeling the chaotic vibration of the trapped nerve cluster pulsing against her skin like a panicked heartbeat. 2, she whispered, her voice steady and commanding, ignoring the stinging sweat in her eyes and the terrified silence of the room. Lorenzo leaned in, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that made him dizzy. He watched the waitress's hands, so rough and work-worn compared to the delicate, pale skin of his daughter, and he held his breath, waiting for the scream that always followed any attempt to touch the leg. But the scream did not come. Instead, Elena rotated her wrist slightly, applying a counterintuitive pressure that defied medical textbooks but honored the ancient wisdom of the Sicilian countryside. She felt the resistance peak, a hard wall of muscular tension fighting back, and she pushed through it with a decisive, fluid motion. 3. She said softly, and suddenly there was a palpable release, not of bone but of tension snapping like a cut wire. Sophia gasped, a sharp, wet intake of air that sounded like a swimmer breaking the surface after being held underwater. Her body, which had been locked in a rigid arch of agony, instantly collapsed back into the soft leather of the chair. Her left leg, previously twisted and hard as iron, fell limp against the carpet, the muscles rippling once before, settling into a state of profound, impossible relaxation. Lorenzo lunged forward, his hands hovering over her, his face a mask of absolute terror, assuming she had passed out from the pain. "Sophia, talk to me," he cried out, his voice cracking. But then, Sophia opened her eyes. The haunted, glazed look of suffering was gone, replaced by a clarity that stunned him. She sat up slowly, blinking tears from her lashes, and looked down at her foot, which was now resting flat on the floor, perfectly still. She wiggled her toes once, twice, movements that had been impossible for 6 months. The silence in the restaurant was absolute, not a fork clinked, not a whisper was exchanged. Sophia looked up at her father, her lips trembling into a smile of pure, disbelief-filled wonder. "It is gone?" she whispered, the words barely loud enough to carry, yet they hit Lorenzo with the force of a physical blow. "Daddy," it stopped. "The pain. It is completely gone." Lorenzo stood frozen, his mind reeling, unable to comprehend the reality before him. He looked at his daughter, then at the waitress who was slowly pulling her hands away, wiping them on her apron as if she had just cleared a plate rather than performed a miracle. The world as he knew it, defined by money, power, and helplessness, had just been dismantled in 10 seconds by a girl named Elena. Lorenzo Moretti felt the mighty structural integrity of his composure finally collapse, his knees hitting the plush carpet with a heavy thud, right beside the spot where the waitress had knelt only moments before. He reached out with shaking hands, his fingers hovering for a second before daring to touch his daughter's left calf, terrified that the contact would trigger another scream, or that he would find the muscle still locked in that grotesque, stone-hard ridge. But when his palm made contact with her skin, the muscle was soft, pliable, and completely at rest. The tension that had defined their existence for half a year had vanished into the ether, leaving behind only the ghost of the trauma. He squeezed gently, looking up at Sophia's face, searching for the flinch, the grimace, the shadow of pain, but he found only a tear-streaked face illuminating with a dawn of relief. "It really stopped? You are not just saying it to protect me?" he choked out, his voice thick with unshed tears and raw vulnerability. Sophia shook her head, letting out a breathy, incredulous laugh that sounded like music to his starved ears. "It is gone, Dad. I can feel my toes again." It is really gone. The reality of it hit Lorenzo like a physical blow to the chest, stealing the air from his lungs. He turned his head slowly, looking up from his position on the floor to the woman standing above him. Elena De Luca had already stepped back, drying her damp hands on the side of her apron, her posture slumped slightly with exhaustion, her eyes cast downward as if she expected a reprimand for breaking the rules. The anger that had consumed Lorenzo only minutes ago, the burning, self-righteous fury at her intrusion dissolved instantly, replaced by a profound, hollowing shame that made his stomach turn. He had screamed at her, he had tried to banish her, he had treated her like an insect to be crushed, and in return, she had given him the one thing his billions could not buy. He looked at her worn shoes, her stained uniform, her tired face, and for the first time he did not see a servant. He saw a savior. The silence in the restaurant was heavy, the air thick with the collective shock of the onlookers who had witnessed the transformation. Lorenzo remained on his knees, a position of supplication he had never taken in his life, looking up at the waitress with eyes wide with awe. "Who are you?" he whispered, the question hanging in the air, not as a demand for identification, but as a genuine expression of wonder. Elena blinked, surprised by the reverence in his tone, and simply shrugged one shoulder, her voice quiet and humble. "Just a waitress, sir. I should get back to my tables before I get in trouble." Lorenzo Moretti slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his knees cracking slightly in the absolute silence, a sound that marked his difficult return from the realm of the helpless parent back to the world of the powerful tycoon. He smoothed the front of his Italian silk suit with trembling hands, needing the tactile sensation of the expensive fabric to ground him in a reality he understood. But his eyes never left the face of the young woman standing before him. To him, the universe operated on a strict system of exchange. Value was given and value must be paid. And he was currently staring at a debt so massive he was unsure if his substantial bank accounts could truly cover it. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth leather of his checkbook, a familiar weapon he had used for decades to silence enemies, bribe politicians, and build skylines. He pulled it out, along with a heavy gold fountain pen, and slapped them down onto the pristine white tablecloth with a decisive thud that echoed like a gavel strike in a courtroom. "Wait right there," Lorenzo commanded, his voice thick with an emotion that sounded like a command but felt entirely like desperation. He flipped the leather cover open, the crisp sound of the paper tearing through the quiet room, a sound of commerce invading the space of a miracle. I do not know what kind of voodoo or magic that was, and frankly, I do not care. You fixed her when the best minds in the world failed. He looked from his daughter's peaceful, smiling face back to Elena's tired, dark eyes, his mind racing to calculate the monetary worth of a miracle. He uncapped the pen with a sharp click, the gold nib hovering over the amount line, shaking slightly as the ink threatened to bleed. "Name your price," he said, the words heavy with intent. "Is it 10,000, 50,000, 100,000? You tell me the number, and I will write it right this second without hesitation." The diners around them leaned in, their eyes widening at the staggering sums being thrown around, watching the waitress with a mixture of envy and judgment, fully expecting her to snatch the check and run. For Lorenzo, this display was not arrogance, it was the only language of love he knew how to speak. He desperately wanted to flood her life with wealth, to bury her in gratitude until the cosmic scales were balanced, because the idea of owing something that could not be bought terrified him more than the poverty she clearly lived in. He pushed the checkbook toward her across the linen, the paper trembling under the force of his intensity. "Do not be shy. You have saved my world tonight. Take it. Change your life." He watched her face closely, expecting greed, expecting relief, waiting for the moment the transaction would be completed so he could feel safe again. Safely back in a world where everything, even kindness, had a price tag attached to it. Elena DeLuca looked down at the open checkbook, lying on the starched white linen tablecloth, where the blank line for the amount seemed to pulse with a seductive and dangerous light. She knew exactly what that piece of paper represented in the harsh arithmetic of her daily existence. It was her nursing school tuition paid in full for the next 2 years without taking another loan. It was the rent for her drafty apartment covered for a decade without working double shifts. It was a new winter coat to replace the one with the broken zipper that let the wind in. It was freedom from the crushing anxiety that woke her up at 3 in the morning. For a fleeting second her hand trembled as the sheer gravity of the offer weighed upon her tired spirit, enticing her to take the easy road out of poverty. But then she looked at Sophia. She saw the girl's legs relaxing naturally under the table, and the tears of relief drying on her cheeks. And the image of her grandmother's kitchen in Sicily rose up in her mind like a protective shield against the temptation of greed. Her nonna had taught her that the gift of healing was a sacred trust, a duty to the community, not a commodity to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. To accept payment for a moment of mercy would be to cheapen the act, turning a connection of the soul into a transaction of the wallet. Elena took a slow, steady breath, exhaling the desire for the money, and reached out with her work-roughened hand. Gently but firmly, she placed her fingertips on the edge of the leather checkbook and slid it back across the table toward the billionaire. "I did not do it for money, Mr. Moretti," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet dignity that silenced the whispers of the room. "I did it because I saw she was hurting. I did it because I knew how to stop it. And no human being should have to suffer like that when there is help standing right in front of them." Lorenzo stared at her, his mouth slightly open, his mind unable to process the data because in his world, everyone had a price, and every favor came with an invoice attached. "But you are a waitress. You need this," he stammered, gesturing vaguely at her uniform, unable to comprehend her refusal. Elena smiled, a sad but genuine expression that softened her tired features. "My grandmother taught me that kindness is not a business transaction, sir. If I took your money, I would be selling the only thing that is truly mine to give. Please, just enjoy your dinner with your daughter." She stepped back, leaving the blank check untouched, a piece of paper worth millions rendered worthless by a single act of integrity. Lorenzo looked at the check, then at her, realizing with a jolting shock that this young woman possessed a wealth of spirit that made his billions look like absolute poverty. Elena De Luca bowed her head slightly in a gesture of respect that felt far more aristocratic than anything the billionaire had ever displayed, and then she turned on her worn, rubber-soled heel to walk away from the table that held enough wealth to solve every problem she had ever known. She crossed the invisible barrier of the velvet rope again, stepping back into the shadows of the service station where Mr. Rossi stood, with his mouth gaping open like a fish pulled from the water. The manager looked from the untouched checkbook to the waitress, his brain short-circuiting as he tried to reconcile his expectation of a disaster with the reality of a miracle. But seeing Lorenzo's stunned silence, he decided that survival was the better part of valor and simply pointed a shaking finger toward table 4. "Just get back to work, De Luca," he whispered hoarsely, his anger deflated by sheer confusion. Elena nodded and immediately picked up a heavy tray of dirty dishes, her body transitioning instantly from healer to servant without a beat of hesitation. Back at table 1, the atmosphere had shifted from a war zone to a cathedral of quiet contemplation. Lorenzo sank back into his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and stared at the empty space where Elena had stood, feeling a strange unsteadiness in his hands that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a shattered world view. He looked at Sophia, who was now calmly drinking water, her legs crossed comfortably under the table, a posture that had been physically impossible for her just 10 minutes ago. "She is incredible, Dad," Sophia murmured, her eyes following Elena's figure as she weaved through the crowded room. She did not even want credit. "She just wanted me to be okay." Lorenzo nodded slowly, picking up the heavy gold pen and capping it with a definitive click, the sound marking the end of his old way of thinking. He watched Elena pour wine for a rude couple at the next table, accepting their dismissal with grace, and he felt a burning in his chest that was entirely new. He realized that he was sitting in debt to a woman who scrubbed floors and carried plates, and for the first time in his life, he understood that the balance sheet of the universe could not be settled with a bank transfer. "We cannot just leave it like this, Sophia," Lorenzo said quietly, his gaze intense as he watched Elena wipe a spill from a table. "I have spent my life believing that every person is a commodity to be bought or sold, but she just proved me wrong. I owe her more than money. I owe her a future." The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of contemplation, the taste of the expensive wine forgotten, as Lorenzo Moretti spent the evening not looking at his phone or his portfolio, but tracking the movements of a tired waitress, plotting a way to repay a debt that had no price tag, knowing that simply leaving a large tip would be an insult to the grace she had shown them. The morning sun, piercing through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Moretti Global headquarters, did not illuminate blueprints for new skyscrapers or contracts for hostile takeovers, but rather a single, thin manila folder resting on the center of the massive mahogany desk. Lorenzo sat in his high-backed leather chair, spinning a gold pen between his fingers, his mind still replaying the events at the restaurant like a film loop he could not pause. He had spent the entire night watching his daughter sleep peacefully for the first time in 6 months, a sight that had solidified his resolve to balance the cosmic scales. He pressed the intercom button on his desk with a decisive click. "Send him in," he commanded, his voice devoid of its usual aggressive edge. The heavy oak doors opened, and his head of private security, a man named Vance, who could find a needle in a haystack if the price was right, walked in silently and placed a digital tablet on the desk. Lorenzo had ordered a full background check on Elena DeLuca at dawn, not to find dirt or leverage, but to discover the hidden cracks in her armor where he could pour his gratitude without her permission. "Tell me everything, Vance. Who is she really?" Lorenzo asked, picking up the tablet. Vance cleared his throat, scrolling through the data. "She is 23, sir. Second-year nursing student at City College. Top of her class, straight as, but she is barely hanging on. She is $112,000 in debt from student loans and medical bills for her late grandmother. She works 60 hours a week at the restaurant just to pay the interest. She lives in a basement studio apartment in the South Ward that has had 3 heating violations this winter alone." Lorenzo listened to the litany of struggle, his jaw tightening with each new detail. He looked at the ID photo of Elena on the screen, her eyes tired but determined, and felt a surge of protective anger that someone with such a divine gift was being crushed by the machinery of poverty. Vance swiped to the final page. "There is one more thing, sir. She submitted a proposal last year for a community pain clinic grant. She wants to combine modern physical therapy with traditional Sicilian manipulation techniques for low-income patients. The board rejected it because she lacked the capital." Lorenzo stared at the rejected application, seeing not a failure, but a roadmap. He realized that Elena did not just need money, she needed a legacy. She was trying to save the world while drowning in it. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city he owned, realizing he finally had a use for his power that actually mattered. "She wants to heal people, Vance," Lorenzo said softly, his reflection ghosting against the glass. "Then we are going to give her the hospital she deserves. Get the lawyers on the phone. We are setting up a trust, anonymous and ironclad. I want her debts gone by noon today." A week later, the unrelenting gray sky over the City College campus mirrored the storm of anxiety churning violently inside Elena DeLuca's stomach as she walked toward the administration building. She had received a terrifyingly vague email from the office of Dean Miller at 6 in the morning with the subject line, "Immediate financial review," a phrase that, in her experience, was polite bureaucratic code for eviction from the program. She gripped the strap of her fraying backpack until her knuckles turned white, her mind frantically racing through a mental ledger of her debts, trying to calculate which loan payment had bounced or which fee was overdue. She felt like an imposter among the other students who sat on the lawn laughing and drinking expensive coffee, separated from them by the invisible, crushing wall of poverty that she was convinced was about to bury her for good. She reached the heavy oak door of the dean's office and hesitated, taking a shaky breath to steady her trembling hands before knocking. "Come in, Miss DeLuca." The voice called out from inside, sounding uncharacteristically cheerful for a man she associated with bad news. Elena pushed the door open and stepped onto the plush carpet, bracing herself for the humiliation of being asked to leave. "I know I am late on the library fees, Dean Miller, but I picked up 3 extra shifts at the restaurant next week, and I promise I can have at least $50 for you by Friday." She blurted out rapidly, her words tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to negotiate for her future before he could deliver the verdict. Dean Miller looked up from his computer, his expression softening into a smile that completely confused her defense mechanisms. He gestured to the leather chair opposite his desk. "Please, sit down, Elena. You are not here because you owe us money. In fact, you are here because of the exact opposite." He reached into his drawer and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope, sliding it across the mahogany surface toward her. "Yesterday afternoon, the college received a substantial wire transfer from a legal trust that wishes to remain completely anonymous. They have established something called the Angel Grant, and you are the sole recipient." Elena stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it, her heart pounding in her ears. "I do not understand, sir. What does that mean?" The dean leaned forward, his eyes twinkling with genuine delight. "It means, Elena, that your outstanding balance is 0. Your tuition for the next 2 years is paid in full. Your books, your lab fees, even your graduation gown, it is all covered. Additionally, the grant includes a monthly living stipend of $3,000 to ensure you can focus on your studies instead of waiting tables." The room spun, the crushing weight vanished. Elena covered her mouth, a ragged sob tearing from her throat as the impossible magnitude of the freedom washed over her. She wept openly, burying her face in her hands, shaking with relief as the chains of debt shattered, completely unaware that her refusal to take a check had earned her a future that money alone could never buy. Elena DeLuca stepped out of the heavy oak doors of the administration building and into the crisp autumn air, but the world looked completely different than it had 1 hour ago. The colors sharper and the sunlight warmer, now that the crushing weight of poverty had been lifted from her shoulders. She wiped the last remnants of happy tears from her cheeks, clutching the cream-colored envelope against her chest like a lifeline, her mind still reeling from the miracle of the anonymous grant that had just saved her future. She expected to walk to the bus stop and return to her humble life, but as she reached the bottom of the stone steps, she stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. Parked right at the curb, gleaming like a black diamond against the gray pavement, was the same armored limousine she had seen outside the restaurant, but it was not the car that made her heart skip a beat. Leaning casually against the passenger door, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of a gown, was Sophia Moretti, and she was standing completely on her own 2 feet without a cane, a wheelchair, or even a grimace of pain. The girl looked vibrant and strong, her posture relaxed as she waved excitedly, a living testament to the 10 seconds that had changed everything. Before Elena could even process the sight, the rear door opened and Lorenzo Moretti stepped out, but the terrifying titan of industry who had screamed at her was gone, replaced by a father looking at her with quiet reverence. Elena rushed forward, the words tumbling out of her mouth in a rush of gratitude. "Mr. Moretti, I know it was you. The tuition, the stipend. I do not know how to thank you. It is too much." Lorenzo held up a hand gently to stop her, a soft smile touching his lips as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick legal document bound in blue velvet. "The tuition was just the interest, Elena. This is the principal," he said, handing her the heavy folder with a solemn weight. Elena opened it, her eyes widening as she read the bold header. Deed of Trust, the DeLuca Community Healing Center. It was not just a building. The fine print detailed an endowment for equipment, staff salaries, and a mandate to serve the poor. "You saved my daughter with your hands when my money was useless," Lorenzo said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed a hand on Sophia's shoulder, uniting the three of them in a circle of grace that transcended class and circumstance. "Do not thank me. Just promise me you will use this place to save the others I cannot reach." Elena looked from the deed to the smiling girl, and finally to the billionaire who had learned that the currency of the heart was the only wealth that mattered. She nodded, tears flowing freely again, knowing that a single act of kindness had rippled outward to change the world. If Elena's journey touched your heart or reminded you of the power of compassion, please give this video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support is the engine that allows us to uncover and share more transformative stories like this one. Make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you are always the first to join us on the next emotional adventure. And please, share this video with someone who feels invisible or undervalued. Remind them that their kindness is a currency more valuable than gold, and their miracle could be waiting in the very next act of service. Thank you for listening.